So I'm happy to present the first report of a research project I have been working on for a year with partly the Jewish Museum in Paris, the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme. So we have already met Louis Lozowick yesterday. Is a photography of him by Ralph Steiner that was representing Lozowick at the Metropolitan Museum exhibition last year about American art and politics. I'll have to draw a few biographical elements, not to repeat what has been said yesterday, but only to be able to go to my point. Nevertheless, I hope there won't be too much repetition, as my talk will focus mainly on the question of Lozowick as an organizer, mediator, producer of the discourse on art between major cities he spent time in, so Moscow, Paris, New York, and in particular today, I will highlight his own narrative on his stay in Berlin. So I will try to raise a few questions based on the reading of his memoirs. To my point of view, and I think it is something that has been said yesterday, Louis Lozowick has not yet been studied within all the aspects of his activities and his international profile. Several works, catalog, have been devoted to his artistic work, but nothing really about his art critique. The three categories of sources that we can mobilize to contextualize his critical discourse are first archival sources. The Louis Lozowick papers are held by the American Art Archives, and they are digitalized. There is additional archival material devoted to him at the Syracuse University that I have not yet been visited. The second sources are the published sources, such as articles by Lozowick himself. It concerns a large corpus. According to my current calculation, it's more than 130 texts. It is texts like catalogs, essays, articles in magazine, as diverse as the magazine of the left, American left, New Masses. We have such artistic modernism, like a Broom, and the Jewish diaspora magazine, such as Menorah journal, on which I will talk about later. The corpus is particularly large for the 20s and the 30s. And the third source we can work on is the memoirs, in which around 100 pages are devoted to his stay away from the United States, and this is the source I will comment today. So Louis Lozowick was born in 1892 in a shtetl, a small Ukrainian village called Ludvinovka, and began his artistic training at the Kiev Art School. In 1906, following in the footsteps of his brother, who was active in the Bund movement and was therefore forced to leave the Pale of Settlement, Lozowick left for the United States, where he was able to complete his training at the National Academy of Design. Lozowick went on to have a solid career as a painter. He is often considered to be a major representative of American precisionism, which has been told yesterday. And his artistic practice was also sensible in his work as an illustrator for prominent left-oriented magazine, and the cover for the New Masses that you have here are just just some of many. Indeed, he also did painting for the New Deal commissions, notably a view of Manhattan for the post office on the 34th Street in New York. Here are some photographs I took during a trip in New York in November 23, and they just have been restored. It's in the Penn Station building now. All of this is important here because it links him very strongly to the American identity of his work, even though, as Andrew Hemingway pointed out, is in an international figure with a complex profile. And in my opinion, Lozowick has not yet found his place in the modern art narrative. However, he is a perfect illustration of the question of circulation of modernism that are interested so many researchers today. Certain facts are well known beyond this artwork. For example, the fact that Lozowick was a popular teacher, as confirmed by students at the Educational Alliance Art School in New York, who referred to him as a walking encyclopedia, or his help in spreading the avant-garde from Moscow to and the Soviet Union after that, which is mentioned many times. He gave several lectures, notably at the Société Anonyme, some of which were collected and published and entitled Modern Russian Art in 1925. And in 1930, he collaborated with two communist writers to publish Voices of October, one of the main sources on Soviet culture in the United States before the Cold War. However, Louis Lozowick is not yet well identified as an original critic of a diverse modern scene that is so in Europe during the interwar. It creates its points of contact, and to understand this role in more details, we are proposing to look back at the 3 years he spent in Europe between 1920 and 1923, which constituted a first step for Lozowick in building his knowledge. In the early 20s, he's in Moscow, and Lozowick met Vladimir Tatlin, Alexander Rodchenko, and Kazimir Malievich, and became interested in stage design after seeing Lyubov Popova theater sets for Meyerhold. He writes about all of this. He returned to Europe at the end of the 20s, and he is again in Moscow in November 27, and I will have a look more closely at this trip at some point of my research, because it's at the same time when when many artists such as Diego Rivera or Alfred Barr from the MoMA are in Moscow. So in the 27 trip, we know also that he met the famous director of the Museum of New Western Art, Boris Ternaviets, which is documented by his correspondence. And Boris Ternaviets even organized an exhibition of Lozowick work in Moscow in 1928. So his ties with Soviet Russia are definitely important. Lozowick not only traveled to Moscow and Ukraine on several occasions, but he also was in Tajikistan in 1931, from where he brought back a series of work. So he has quite a broad experience of Soviet Union in his space and his diversity as well. After highlighting these few elements, I can quote, for example, what Blumenfeld wrote in Les Hommes du Jour. In Les Hommes du Jour, Annales politique, sociale, littéraire et artistique about Lozowick. Let's say that Lozowick represents American painting in Paris in its most synthetic form. His canvases, dominated by the greatest city in the United States, allow us to conceive the Yankee mentality, the American spirit, and to judge the taste of these energetic people. Lozowick distinguishes himself by the constructive power of his composition, but there is also a sense of modern sensibility, which has its authenticity. In his works, the art critic competes the painter. The many articles published by this young American reveal a sober, lucid, and forward-thinking critic, in short, a precursor. So Lozowick is, for the Parisian critic in the early 20s, the perfect example of an American spirit, while he will become also very soon an illustrator and an historian of European and Soviet avant-garde. The multiplicity I want to analyze, Lozowick himself sums up it perfectly in his memoir with those lines. Having gone through an American university and art academy, having served in the American army, having studied American history, art, literature, and having voted for American election, I have always considered myself a full-fledged, if only naturalized, American. At the same time, I have retained a love of Russian culture and followed as much as possible the development of its art and literature. It was therefore natural that I should want to meet some of the Russian quoted in Paris and Berlin when I came there. During his stay in Paris, Lozowick didn't meet only the Russians, but also Juan Gris, as well as Fernand Léger, whose aesthetic would have an impact on his machine series that Lozowick will develop from 1922 onwards. He took part in various activities organized by the Parisian Dadaists and attended readings by Ilyas Danievich, which he described it in details. He already felt half Parisian, in his own word, when he was offered the chance to move to Berlin. In my opinion, his stay in Germany represents a key moment in his critical activity, during which he added a third string to his bow. In short, his stay in Germany was not only Berlin, he has also visited other German cities such as Leipzig, Munich, Dresden, Cologne, Nuremberg. He exhibited among the avant-garde, frequented the Russian constructivists. He also took part in publishing projects. We find him around the Yiddish literary journal Albatros here, and a work published in 1922 on a Jewish graphic art by Metropolises Edition, a Russian publishing house that existed between 1920 and 1939 in Berlin. But those last two elements, if we know their existence, they are not mentioned in Lozowick memoirs. I would now like to look at the Berlin period with the help of Lozowick autobiographical text, about which I need to say a few words to begin. So this text, the text of his autobiography was edited in 1997 by the historian of art, Virginia McCart, so more than 20 years after Lozowick's death, and it was published by the Smithsonian. These memoirs are the result of a manuscript that Lozowick began in 1945 and worked until his death in 1973. The original manuscript is in the archive, in the American archives. The manuscript, which remained unpublished for a long time, is often used in text about Lozowick and quoted as an unpublished manuscript courtesy of Adele Lozowick, his wife. So we can imagine how the documents circulated physically or through the words of the widow before being published at the end of the 90s. The book consists in four parts, 11 chapters, plus several articles by Lozowick on art. This text deals with his childhood in Ukraine through the prism of the Tsarist Empire relationship to the Jews, his life and his years in Europe, in Berlin, Paris, and Moscow notably. But Lozowick's original manuscript deal only with Europe, parts 1 and 3 of the book. Parts 2 and 4 are additions to the manuscript by Virginia McCart. These two parts, of few pages each, deal with Lozowick's life in the United States and were produced by McCart based on Lozowick interview with students and archival documents. So I have only worked, on the original part for the moment. The first observation Lozowick makes in his Berlin chapter is a comparison with the city he had just left, Paris. So he looks for equivalence between districts and approach the Romanisches Café as an equivalent of the Rotonde in Montparnasse. He was only due to stay in Berlin for a few months before returning to Paris, but he decided to stay longer. He said he was particularly enthusiastic about a life in Berlin and the lower cost of living. Above all, he felt that the Russian colony in Berlin was more active. I quote him, if Paris was too much preoccupied by the fantastic dream of a victorious return to Holy Russia, Russian activities in Berlin were more up-to-date. Finer books, magazines were being published, and Soviet publications were arriving in an unending stream. He also makes a clear distinction between the two Russian communities, between Berlin and Paris. I quote him again. In Berlin, Soviet citizens, diplomats, writers, artists, and actors were very much in evidence. There were also fairly large group of emigres preaching reconciliation with the motherland on the basis of non-political involvement. His introduction to the newest Soviet artworks came through this channel, and he described discovering Vladimir Mayakovsky's mystery booth during an invitation to Ilya Ehrenburg's flat in Berlin. Lozowick appeared as one of the most relevant witnesses to the circulation of Russian art through diaspora and certain centers where Berlin played, of course, a pioneering role. Lozowick produced several works during his stay and exhibited with the November Gruppe and the Jury-freie Kunstschau, the Jury-freie Art Show, which he compared to the Salon des Indépendants, and also showed work in 1922 in the International Show in Düsseldorf. He also had a solo exhibition at Trolley Bookshop at Potsdamer Straße at the end of the 1922. He described that what he exhibited there as American nostalgia. There is work were exhibited a second time at the Gallery Alfred Heller in September 1923. He is happy to be well received by the critic, and his work was well publicized in the German press as a result. Thanks to his reception, on his return to the United States, his work was well identified as well. In the Berlin chapter, Lozowick immediately discusses the artists he has worked with, starting with the Russian names Altman, Lisitsky, Rybak, Puni, Naum Gabo, and David Sternberg. He distinguishes this name from those who identifies as international avant-garde, we met in the same cafe and sometimes in private reception. The encounter he highlights most is with Lisitsky. He's very eloquent about Lisitsky, and the first few lines he devotes to him embody precisely what it seemed to me to be the key turn of Lozowick thought, which occurred precisely during his stay in Berlin. So he wrote about Lisitsky. Mild-mannered, soft-spoken, very gifted, yet modest, he was positive in his view, even though those views changed considerably over the years. The revolution of 1905 brought to a head, out of the many accumulated grievances among the many minor nationalities, the demand for cultural autonomy, for the right of a national identity. Following or alongside other nationalities, the Jews undertook a vast study of their heritage. They organized groups for the gathering and recording of folk art in all its forms: legends, folk tales, songs, proverbs, superstitions. They sent out the expedition of artists who traveled through the Pale of Settlement, copying synagogue murals, limited marriage licenses, ketubah, folk drawings, paintings for the home and synagogue, etc. The description of the ethnographic expedition takes up another old paragraph in the Lozowick text. And it is only afterwards that Lozowick turns to Lisitsky constructivism. But here again, he refers to later events such as the exhibition of Lozowick in Hanover. They are also significant because apart from this part, Lozowick makes no mention of Jewish network, and at no point does he refer to Yiddish in his chapter, even though the photograph with the Albatross Journal attests to his activities within the network. And yet, the pivotal moment of his stay in Berlin is marked in Lozowick's career and its interest by the openness to the Yiddish. It was after his stay in Berlin that Lozowick became an important voice of Eastern European Jewish life. At this time, he published many articles for the Menorah Journal, a little-known magazine which appeared from 1915 onwards, rather irregularly, particularly in the last issue, until 1962, linked to the Menorah. Linked to the Menorah Association, which emerged from the Harvard Menorah Society, a Jewish campus formed in 1906 by Henry Hurwitz, born in Lithuania in 1886, who founded the Menorah Journal and wrote it regularly. The journal tone was characterized by a desire to define a Jewish culture in a rather original and American-centric way. Culture was not the main point of the journal. A section around 8 images and 4 pages were generally devoted to visual art in each issue, with few pages on music, appearing very occasionally, while literature was covered more often. For the Menorah Journal, Lozowick wrote monographic articles devoted to many well-known figures, Chagall, Lipschitz, Altman, Lisitsky, etc., and those texts are characterized by their pedagogical approach. In addition, he also produced illustration directly linked to this collaboration with the magazine. In June 25, an article by Lewis Mumford entitled "Toward Modern Synagogue Architecture" was accompanied by a series of drawings by Lozowick. In addition to this corpus from the Menorah Journal, we can also mention that in 1947, he published a monograph, 100 American Jewish Artists, for which he wrote a panoramic introduction to give an idea of Jewish art going back to before the 20th century, and then compiling 100 short monographic notes. To say a few concluding words, Lozowick was an important spreader for modern art from Central and Eastern European to the United States. Despite his strong attachment to several structures, museum, institutions like the Dreyer Institution in New York, the journals, defending transnational modern art, Lozowick eventually turned his attention to forms that defend ethnic interests or claims. And it is this trajectory, together with Lozowick's wide range of interest, his great curiosity, and his many contacts, that give his art criticism of certain originality. I will also say, following a question that was also asked yesterday, that this particular commitment for Lozowick could be an explanation of why he was not questioned during the McCarthyism, as he's clearly identified as a communist during the 20s and the 30s. Thank you.